All right, let's dive in. You've probably seen it a million times. You walk into a bookstore, and there's that section, Third World Literature. But have you ever really stopped to think about who decided to create that category in the first place? In this explainer, we're going behind the scenes. We're not just looking at the books on the shelf. We're going to investigate the very blueprint that built the shelf itself.
It just feels normal, right? It feels like a natural category. Literature from certain parts of the world. Simple enough. But what if it isn't natural at all? What if it was actually invented, not just discovered, for very specific reasons by very specific people? That's the big question we're tackling today. Who gets to decide what third world literature is? And, more importantly, why?
So, to get our heads around this, we have to start with a pretty radical idea. Literary categories, things like the Great American Novel or science fiction, they aren't just born, they're built. They are quite literally assembled piece by piece like a machine to do a specific job in a specific place.
And here it is, the central argument from our source material. Get this, the label Third World Literature didn't actually come from the writers in Africa or Asia or Latin America. It was put together, assembled inside Western universities, places in England and North America. And they weren't doing it out of pure literary curiosity. No, they were responding to their own internal institutional pressures. They needed a new box, a new category for all these texts, and so they built one.
Okay, let's pause on this term because it is absolutely crucial. When we say metropolitan university, we're not just talking about some old buildings with ivy on the walls. We're talking about the epicenters of academic power in the West. These are the institutions that have the global authority to decide what gets studied, how it gets studied, and what we all call it. They are, for all intents and purposes, idea factories. And the categories they manufacture, well, they have a massive ripple effect all over the world.
So you're probably asking, how in the world does something like that happen? Well, our source points to what you could call a perfect storm. It wasn't just one thing. It was four major forces all hitting at the same time. First, literary theory in the West was kind of having a crisis. At the same time, a flood of new texts from non-Western countries became available. Then, a new generation of immigrant academics, scholars from former colonies, started working in these universities. And finally, the political idea of the three worlds came along and provided a super convenient, ready-made label for the whole thing.
And this is where we see the real-world impact. See, the ideas that are cooked up in London or New York, they don't just stay there. They get exported. They start shaping how literature is taught in places like India. And our source uses this incredibly powerful phrase to describe it, parasitic intellectual dependence. It's this idea that universities in post-colonial nations end up looking to the West for all their big ideas and theories, sometimes even at the cost of understanding their own local culture on their own terms.
But before this whole new category could even be built, the old ways of thinking had to get shaken up first. You see, before the 1960s, the world of English literature was basically a battleground between two totally different, competing ideas about what literature even is. All right, so here's the clash of the titans, laid out side by side. In one corner, you have the British tradition. These guys, like F.R. Leavis and Raymond Williams, believed that literature was completely woven into the fabric of society and history. And in the other corner, you have American New Criticism, which argued the exact opposite. For them, a text was like an island, totally separate, and it had to be studied in complete isolation from the outside world.
Let's dig into the British approach for a second. For them, a book was always part of a social matrix. You couldn't dream of understanding a great novel without understanding the class struggles, the cultural moments, the whole social tapestry that it came from. It was all about the big picture, the grand unfolding story of a society.
Now, the American approach, New Criticism, was a complete rebellion against that. Their whole philosophy was basically, forget the author's biography, forget the historical context, forget what was happening in society. All that matters are the words on the page. They championed this method called close reading, which was like a forensic analysis of the text itself, treating a poem like the secret object sealed under a glass dome, completely protected from the messiness of the real world.
So why did this super isolated way of reading become so huge in America? Well, this quote right here gives us a surprisingly practical clue. It had a massive pedagogical advantage. Think about it. A professor could walk into a classroom, hand out a short poem, do this dazzling technical analysis of its structure and language, and bing, the 50-minute class is over. It was clean, it was efficient, it was perfectly designed for the machinery of a modern university schedule.
But of course, that little sealed-off world of New Criticism couldn't last forever, because then the 1960s happened. and the radicalism of the streets, as our source calls it, came crashing right through the doors of the ivory tower, demanding that literature start talking about the real world again.
And you can just feel the pressure building here. It's not just one thing. It's the civil rights movement, massive anti-war protests, the rise of the New Left, the women's movement, and all of this wasn't just happening somewhere out there, it was exploding on campus. Students were looking at their curriculum and demanding that it reflect the urgent political realities of race, class, war, and power that they were living through.
And all that pressure, it basically cracked the old system wide open. Suddenly there was space to be political, to be critical. Black literature, which had been ignored for so long, was finally forced onto the curriculum. Brand new women's studies programs were created to dig up all of these hidden histories. And for really the first time in American academia, Marxism became a serious theoretical tool that you could use to analyze power in literature. The whole game was changing.
But this leads to a really fascinating and kind of tricky question. What happens when a revolution gets a PhD? This next part of the story traces the ironic and maybe even a little tragic journey of that 1960s radical energy as it gets absorbed and professionalized by the university.
So here's the pivotal moment. The exact same people who were out in the streets protesting in the 60s became the new assistant professors of the 70s. Now, they absolutely brought their politics with them into the classroom, but they were also entering this massive institution that had its own logic, its own career paths, its own rules for how you survive and succeed. And this is the transformation that our source describes. That raw, fiery energy of the street protest got channeled into, well, academic performance. The struggle on the streets was replaced by the day-to-day drudgeries of professional life. Protesting was replaced by publishing papers. Radicalism became less about a political practice and more about having the right theoretical bearing. Basically, learning to talk and write the brilliant papers that would get you tenure.
Now, to be clear, this new professional radicalism produced some incredibly important stuff. One of the biggest was this new field called colonial discourse analysis. This was a hugely important project. Scholars started going back to the classic Western novels, books by people like Shakespeare, Jane Austen, Joseph Conrad, and they began to expose how these celebrated works were actually tangled up in the history of colonialism and empire. It was a way of doing political work, but now it was happening from inside the academic machine.
Okay, and this brings us to the final and maybe the most cynical stage of our story. What happens when even the most radical, world-changing ideas enter the intellectual marketplace of the modern university? Well, the argument here is that theory itself becomes just another product on the shelf.
So, around this time, a new set of ideas, often called post-structuralism, becomes super popular. Now, in very, very simple terms, these theories really question the whole idea of a stable, unified human self. But a major side effect of this, our source argues, was that the focus shifted away from older concerns like class struggle, economics, and material reality, and moved towards a focus on language, discourse, and the nature of the text itself. And this slide, right here, this is maybe the single most crucial distinction in the entire argument. On the one hand, you had the old internationalism of the left. This was a political project. Its goal was to unite oppressed people across borders to fight for revolution and change the world. On the other hand, you have the new globalism of capitalist circuits. This is a market project. Its goal is to unite the world to buy and sell cultural goods. And the tragic irony is that a category like third world literature can end up serving the market, turning powerful stories of struggle into exotic items for consumption in the West.
I mean, this quote just says it all, doesn't it? It's basically a declaration that the era of big, world-changing revolutions is done. Now we're in the age of the enjoyment of goods and services. We're all just shoppers in a giant global marketplace. And even a radical novel about colonialism from the third world can become just another interesting product in the shopping cart, another good or service to be consumed.
So, we end up right back where we started, thinking about that bookshelf. If a category like third world literature wasn't something natural that we just discovered, but was something that was actively constructed by powerful institutions, well, it forces you to ask a bigger question, right? What other categories that we take for granted, in our culture, in our society, even in our own lives, were also assembled by someone else? And, maybe the most important question of all, whose interests do they really serve?